Hunter and I debate the resolution resolved. On balance, a one-day national primary would be more beneficial for the U.S. than our current presidential primary process. To begin, voting allows citizens to express their interest, creating a government which is most representative of those interests. Therefore, the primary purpose of the primary process is to enable voters to maximize their influence by creating the most representative government. Contention 1, creating competition. The typical competitive primaries of today are a luxury. Candidates of diverse backgrounds compete in long campaigns in front of the nation. However, this couldn't be the case under a national primary, which would require more funds and popularity up front for potential candidates, as explained by Terry Shoemaker of U.S. News. Only well-known wealthy candidates would even ever get on the ballot. A primary calendar spanning months gives lesser-known, underfunded candidates a chance to grow their campaigns. The current process supports lesser-known candidates in two ways. First, it allows lesser-known candidates to gain media attention. Adam Schiffler writes in the Journal of Political Science, though some presidential primary candidates would be able to parlay spikes in grassroots enthusiasm into increased news coverage, this process bypasses candidates who would stand to benefit most from it, underground candidates. Outsider candidates hoping to break into the race through grassroots mobilization would be unable to do so in a national primary. Fortunately, according to Ernest McGowan of the University of Richmond, pre-primary underdogs receive larger benefits from increases in media coverage than frontrunners, and momentum can be created for them beyond just New Hampshire. Second, it allows campaign financing to be much more feasible. An empirical analysis by Rutgers University's Richard Lau found even wealthy candidates can't manage a multitude of simultaneous campaigns. Indeed, if a large number of states all decide to hold their primary on the same day, the candidates must spread their finite campaign resources too thinly. In simultaneous elections, they find that there will be a 14 to 20% decrease in election effort in each state, and a 2 to 3% decrease in the probability that citizens end up choosing the candidate which best represents their interests. By allowing more competitive elections, the current process increases turnout. Benny Gaze of the University of Brussels conducted a meta-analysis and empirically found that increases in election competitiveness cause increases in turnout. Moreover, a study by Notre Dame's Patrick Flavin found more competitive elections receive more attention from the media and interested voters, which further increases election effort, increasing turnout in a cycle. Contention 2, responsible representatives. Subpoint A, democratic deliberation. The current process produces the most representative nominees by allowing voters to acquire more knowledge about candidates for two reasons. First, the sequential order allows candidates to demonstrate viability. Dennis Thompson of Harvard University explains, a series of primaries provides opportunities for candidates to demonstrate their character. They have more opportunities to be tested and in a greater variety of settings. Winning an early contest increases voter perception of a candidate's viability. Vanderbilt's Stephen Yuch finds when a candidate shifts from non-viable to viable, voters seek out 20 to 25% more information on that candidate. Second, a more competitive election motivates more learning. Cindy Kam of Vanderbilt finds when a race is close, subjects think more about the candidates and seek out more issue-based information, accounting for a 15% increase in information seeking. Richard Lau of Rutgers corroborates enhanced political knowledge increases the probability that primary voters choose the candidate which best represents their interests by about 7%. A national primary would not allow for the same deliberation and information seeking, leaving voters to make less informed and unrepresentative decisions. Subpoint B, stopping splitting. Vote splitting occurs when one faction of similar voters disperse their votes amongst multiple similar candidates. This can lead to nominees which, receiving a plurality of votes, don't actually best represent the party. Richard Conley of the University of Florida explains the current primary process is aimed at winnowing the field of contenders through competition, producing a candidate with the greatest level of consensus in each party. As this consensus-building process decreases vote splitting, the probability of selecting the condorcet, or correct winner, increases dramatically. Richard Lau of Rutgers University quantifies in 2012, as the field is winnowed down from 5 to 2 remaining candidates, the probability of casting a vote which best represents any individual voter preferences increases by 44%. George Deltis at the University of Illinois compared a one-day primary to our current sequential process and found the probability that the Condorcet winner is selected as a nominee increases from 51.5% under simultaneous voting to 85.8% under sequential voting, a 34% increase. For these reasons, we urge you to negate.
Judges? Because it fixes a broken system, Lofton and I affirm resolved. On balance, a one-day national primary would be more beneficial for the United States than our current presidential primary process. Contention 1, one person, one vote. The disproportionate impact of early voting states in sequential primaries deprives later states of equal representation. Elaine Carmark of the Brookings Institution explains in 2015, the first primaries become the place where the field of candidates is narrowed and the winner gains all-important momentum to catapult them into later primaries. Empirically, Barbara Norander of the University of Arizona found winning New Hampshire or Iowa extends campaigns 61 or 37% respectively in comparison to the average candidate. Further, Brian Knight of Brown University finds voters in states with early primary races, such as New Hampshire and Iowa, have up to 5 times the influence of voters in later states. This creates 2 harms. First, it disenfranchises voters in later states. John Martin, writing for the New Republic, finds in 2000, both Gore and Bush became unstoppable before 33 states had voted. In 2004, Kerry locked up the nomination when less than 3% of the nation's electorate had voted for him. And in 2012, by the time Romney became the de facto nominee, he had won a majority in just 3 states. If democracy requires consulting more than a fraction of voters, our nominating system is hardly democratic. Second, it produces unrepresentative nominees. William Fry of the Brookings Institution finds the 2 early headliners rank 5th and 2nd respectively on smallest racial minority electors at 8% and 6% compared to 31% nationally, and both states have electorates which are older and considerably less urban than the nation as a whole. Shanna Merkowitz of the Pacific Standard finds this produces candidates chosen by a minority who are not representative of the actual makeup of the country, but are the candidates that voters must pick between on the November ballot. A one-day national primary would grant equal voice to all, increasing political enfranchisement and representation. Contention 2, turnout. Low voter turnout in current sequential primaries harms governance for 2 reasons. First, it decreases government efficiency by increasing polarization. Paul Steenkist writes for Stanford University, while the majority of Americans are politically moderate, the most polarized voters go to the polls in greater numbers in primaries. The smaller the voter pool, the more weight a single vote carries, and the more a partisan minority can determine an election's outcome. This increases dangerous partisanship and decreases cooperation on policy. Nolan McCarty of Princeton explains in 2015, Congress is far less willing to delegate policy-making authority to executive agencies when there are significant ideological disagreements between the president and congressional majorities. It relies far less on the expertise of bureaucracy and implementation of statutes, leading to excessive statutory constraints. Second, distorting policy that is implemented. Jan Laley of American University finds people with higher levels of education and income with more conservative economic views are far more likely to cast ballots. As a result, Sean McElwee writes for The Atlantic, in low turnout elections, politicians are incentivized to cater to the interests of a small portion of the general public and are likely to spend less time relating on bills in housing, welfare, and health care. A one-day national primary would increase voter turnout and reduce these harms in 2 ways. First, by simplifying the nomination process. Norvander explains a single national date would reduce voter confusion and increase turnout. Second, by making citizens, especially in later states, feel like their vote matters. According to Rhodes Cook of the University of Virginia in 2004, a national primary would make all votes meaningful since they would be cast concurrently and would thus increase voter participation. As a whole, Bruce Altschuler of the State University of New York finds in 2008, there's no doubt that voter turnout in a national primary would be considerably greater than in the current system. In turn, lower income, less educated, and younger voters would likely constitute a greater percentage of the total. A report from the University of Virginia concludes, a national primary day could keep party nominees more in line with mainstream views. Vote for progress, vote pro. Are you ready for cross?
Yes. Okay. Is everybody ready? As the first speaker, I'll have the first question. So what is the end goal of our representative democracy?
Well, the end goal is representative nominees, but the process is crucial. Because if you just look at the outcome of an election, that would justify a dictatorship as long as the dictator were representative. So you need the process to be democratic to have a truly representative democracy. To be fair, the problem with a dictatorship being representative is I think in America that wouldn't represent the views of what most people end up wanting, right? Okay. But to be fair, representativeness is a standard we can agree on in the round. Okay, so let me ask you a question about representative. Hold on, is that true or not? Yeah, sure, but let me ask you a question about representative. Yes. When you give us all these studies saying that the possibility of a representative nominee will increase without a national primary, how do you find this representative nominee? The representative nominee, I mean, like, I actually don't understand your question. What is the implication of this? How do we determine a representative nominee is by asking everyone and giving them equal political voice. Okay, so if not everyone is turning out, or if their votes don't matter, it's literally impossible to find a representative nominee. Okay, let's look hypothetically, right? Let's say that, like, both Hunter and I want one policy, you and Lofton want a different policy, right? Okay. Let's say that we all vote, okay? Sure. There's going to be a policy outcome. Let's say that only you and I vote. There's going to be a policy outcome. Okay.
Reducing the size of the field doesn't inherently change representativeness, only if there's a difference between the people who vote and people who don't vote.
Yeah,
right?
and
So
that's what
I'd
we
like to
show
ask,
you in our case.
Okay. I'd like to
Yeah.
ask you a question about that.
Yeah.
Then. I'm glad that we're getting to this.
Absolutely.
You say that there is a difference between people who don't vote and who vote in terms of ideology. Is that empirical or is that a man's analysis?
It's empirical. His analysis is based on empirics.
Okay, so if it was based on empirics, I'm very surprised because George Washington University does the empirical analysis and says there is no statistically significant ideological difference between people who do and don't vote in primaries.
In primaries? Wait, why is that true? Because only the most ideological voters vote in primaries because there's such low
The problem with that
turnout.
is that's actually not true. Individuals who vote in primaries are actually most likely to comprise the party base, more likely to be moderate. They're not likely to be
Wait,
ideologically extreme.
That's not
the
true
opposite
at all.
is true.
Okay, no. Empirically,
You
when
can
you
say
look
it's
at
not
no,
true.
right?
I
I,
mean-
can give you empirical analysis too, but look
Okay,
at
well,
the logic.
okay.
What is the logic behind your statement?
The logic
Why is it
behind-
that people who are more interested in politics and are more polarized would be equally likely to
See,
vote
there's
as
the thing. You're
moderates?
saying that they're more interested in politics and
Give
more
me the
polarized.
logic. No,
the logic
why?
I just gave you is that they're members of the party base, which means they're more likely to be moderate. And Hunter's going to bring up that analysis in the
Wait,
rebuttal
the
as well.
party base is not necessarily more moderate, especially the party base and the establishment right now. They're the ones with the strongest views on the on each party
Hold
position.
on, what's an
right?
example of that?
Like, what do you mean?
Like, right now you say
if
the
I'm a
party
party
base-
activist, I'm a lot more likely to vote than a party moderate, right? Or a rank and file member of society.
I think that's definitely not true.
Like, I can give you empirical analysis too, but
Okay.
let's like.
So one of the
further
things,
talk
to
about
be,
this
to be fair though,
further.
that does hinge on turnout, and Hunter would argue to show you why turnout is higher under the current process anyways, but I think it is
Yeah,
a
if you
critical
wanna prove
distinction
that,
there.
sure.
I still think that's a critical distinction.
Okay.
With that, we've got 5 seconds
Sure,
left.
that's
Anything you
fine.
want to say?
Nah, it's fine.
Okay.
Alright, I'm going to give an observation and then straight down everything they say. I'll try and be as specific as possible. Is everyone ready? The thing that matters in America is whether or not the government represents the populace. Even if the populace doesn't vote, if the government represents them, that is why we have America. The right to vote also includes the right not to vote if you're satisfied with the government. With that said, they give you 2 conditions. The first one is that they say 1 person, 1 vote. They say early states get an undue amount of influence. We have 3 responses. First, Northwestern does an empirical analysis, and they found that early states and early voters don't have any increase in power because though they vote first and set momentum, they are more likely to vote for candidates that will eventually drop out of the race. For example, Iowa this year voted for Ted Cruz. He has since dropped out of the race, thereby by my opponent's logic, all of them wasted their votes. Momentum didn't play out in the way that they thought it would. Secondly, though, understand that U.S. News points out that momentum effects happen either way. It's just that in the status quo, they occur via competition. That is, if you win Iowa, you get momentum. If you lose Iowa, if you don't win an election, you can't win the broader election. However, U.S. News points out that that same winnowing process occurs in a national primary, except it occurs before the competition begins, based on who the elites and who donors decide to support. Who has the most money are the only people that can run in the first place. But thirdly and finally, if you want a comparative analysis, we give you the Deltas analysis at the bottom of our case that says when you move from a sequential process to, or when you move from a simultaneous primary being a national primary to a sequential contest, you increase the chance that you represent the Condorcet or most democratically representative candidate by 34%. That's the easiest way for you to negate. Then they give you 2 impacts. First, they say that you disenfranchise voters at the end of the spectrum. However, an analysis by Pingley of the University of South Carolina points out that there is no relationship between the date of a primary and the amount of turnout that was expected to come out. For example, California voted very late in the cycle this year after both primaries were decided, yet they saw one of the highest turnout rates in the world, in the country, and a record high for California of 49% this year. Secondly, they say that it's not representative because early states are the ones that decide and they're not representative. We have 2 responses here as well. First, the University of Missouri points out that even if Iowa is typically white, that does not mean that they vote in a different way than the rest of the nation. Specifically, they say that if you were to select one state to represent the country, Iowa would be one of the best choices that you could possibly make. Secondly, though, my opponent's analysis stops at Iowa and New Hampshire. Why did they stop after the first 2 states when there are 2 more that occur in just a week afterwards? Those next 2 states are South Carolina and Nevada. South Carolina is predominantly African American, and Nevada is predominantly Hispanic. That is where you represent minority interests, even if you bought their Iowa and New Hampshire analysis. Then they give you a second digit about turnout. They say turnout is low for 2, or they say that turnout is important for 2 reasons. First, they say that if turnout is low, there's more polarization. We have 2 responses. First, George Soros, Harvard graduate, wrote in his book that when moderate when the turnout is low in primaries, that typically produces more moderate candidates, not more polarized ones. So the reason are that those that are educated and are part of the party base want to elect a viable candidate that can win in the general election. That is usually a moderate candidate. As a result, in reality, my opponent's relationship is false. But secondly, if you look to George Washington University, who actually do a statistical analysis on this subject, unlike my opponent's evidence, it says that when there is no statistical relationship between the amount of turnout in an election and the amount of polarization elected by those voters. Secondly, they say that you distort policy. We have two responses. First, if there's no polarization, there's no distortion of policy. Their link in is the first argument. But secondly, they can't give you a single example. Conversely, if you look to Iowa, Ted Cruz won even though he took on the ethanol subsidies lobby. That means that you're not pandering to states. In fact, some candidates are directly fighting them and still winning the general electorate, the general voters. Then they give you two impacts. First, they say that voters are confused, they don't know the date. We have two responses. First, Lau says that in a national primary there's less media coverage, meaning that voters know less, meaning that they are less likely to know the date even then. But secondly, Iowa votes very early, as they say. So they say that Iowa gets a disproportionate amount of media coverage. Yet turnout in Iowa was very low. That plays into the Pingley analysis. Just because someone votes early does not mean that they have a high turnout. Then secondly, they say that there's even more turnout later on. They give two pieces of analysis. However, there's no actual statistical analysis on that subject. It's just one blogger saying that he thinks turnout will increase. If you look to the gays evidence, though, note that we turn turnout by having more competitive elections. There's a statistical relationship. Hold yourself to the evidence, and I hope that you'll negate.
Is everybody ready? A national primary brings national representation. As an overview to our opponent's case, realize that when you're designing a democratic system like the nomination of a president, it has to reflect the will of the people. The current system doesn't, but a national primary does. According to Kenneth Bayer of the Democracy Journal, from 1952 to 1988, Gallup polling has consistently shown that Americans prefer a national primary. More recently, Caroline Tolbert found in 2009 that 73% of Americans prefer a national primary. This creates an a priori reason to vote pro in today's round, because regardless of the actual consequences of a national primary, we must have it in place to maintain the legitimacy of the democratic institution of the primary process. Our opponents start off their case by saying that the representative result is all that matters. But remember what Eileen brings up in Crossfire. This would justify a dictator as long as they have popular support. The process is really important, and making sure that everybody's voice is heard is really important. In our opponent's first contention, they talk about competition and say that a national primary would increase funds. The first problem with our opponent's analysis is that the status quo is actually more expensive than a national primary would be. Zainab and Firgo of Purdue University find that a national primary is 60% less expensive than the current system. The reason for that is twofold. In the current system, once somebody wins an early primary like Iowa, they want to spend more money so that they can capitalize on that victory. Then the losers from Iowa also want to spend more money so that they can try to catch up to the winner. That's the logic. Then our opponents talk about how first there's going to be this increase in media attention for the underdog candidates. First, realize they're only benefited if they win these early states, but they're harmed even more if they lose these states because it proves that they're not viable. Realize that this is a more probable outcome, as by definition the underdog is going to lose more often. But second, even if our opponents prove to you that the underdogs are actually being helped, that's not a good thing for representative democracy or for our governance for two reasons. First, the candidates who have establishment backing are those with experience in government, like former senators. Second, they're more representative because by definition, the parties represent their members, and those who the party backs are the establishment candidates who have representation. Then second, our opponents talk about spreading resources too thin. First, realize that this contradicts our opponent's second contention, subpoint B, about vote splitting. Realize that vote splitting is the definition of competition because candidates are trying to vie for votes among similar voters, so they have to clear that out before they gain access to any of their impacts. Second, they talk about this Lau analysis, finding that there's going to be increased representation with the current system, but there are two problems with that. First, there's absolutely no way to know who the right or representative candidate is unless you actually ask the people in a primary where everybody's voices matter. Second, when you actually look at the analysis our opponents give you, he concludes that it's actually more beneficial to have a national primary. He finds that in the current system, it's barely better voting than just randomly selecting a candidate because of what we talk about in our case. Then in our opponent's second contention, they talk about representative, and in their first subpoint, they talk about deliberation. First, realize that the candidates can demonstrate viability by other metrics, like polls or debates. Second, when you increase the length of the primary process, like happens in the status quo, you make voters apathetic so they tune out. Daniel Roberts of the University of Tennessee finds the actual effect of the long primary process is causing voter apathy so they completely tune out of debates. Then when our opponents talk about increasing learning, realize that with the longer campaign, you just increase wrong learning. According to Martin Wistock of Orange County Register in 2015, the longer the campaign, the more special interest money goes into that campaign. That's dangerous because according to Kenneth Winnick of the University of Arizona, 56% of money going in by special interest groups in the primary process goes to misleading advertising, which negatively harms learning. Then in our opponent's subpoint B, they talk about stopping vote splitting. First, realize they don't have a warrant here, but rather the opposite is going to happen for 3 reasons. First, candidates can drop out before the national one-day primary, like already happens. Take, for example, the last Democratic nomination, Chafee, Webb, and Lessig all dropped out before the Iowa primary. Second, even if they don't drop out, according to Rod Vichy of Fair Vote, a national primary could have ranked choice voting where voters list the candidates they want in order, which would solve that and create perfect coordination. And third, even if they don't have that, they can have a runoff election, like past proposals for a one-day primary have all had a runoff election, which would require a runoff if there isn't a majority. But then looking at our opponent's deltas analysis, realize that one, you can actually turn this argument against our opponents because they actually looked at a primary where 22 states, in 2008, when 22 states had a primary on the same day, like a national primary, and they actually found that that was when there was the benefit. So it's actually supporting the idea of a national primary. So for all these reasons, we urge a pro-ballot. All right.
Is it okay if I ask the first question?
Sure.
You said that a sequential process is 60% more expensive than a national primary.
Right.
Why? Why does the author say that?
So I give you the 2 reasons. So say, for example,
but why does he say this?
Well, that's exactly the analysis he says. The winner spends more because they're trying to capitalize on their victory. The loser spends more because they're trying to catch up.
How does he conduct his experiment?
So he does a behavioral analysis, asking people in a of college undergraduate students. He does a behavioral analysis of what's going on when people are given money and they're in a primary-like situation.
What's the primary-like situation?
Well, it's a controlled study, right? So they're in a laboratory.
They're betting on computer games.
Right. So, okay, what's actually happening is that they have a model of what happens in a primary process. And they have an event happen, like say they win the Iowa primary, they win an early event, then in that case, they spend more money. Even if they also lose, they also spend more money to increase that probability.
So your argument is that giving money to college students to bet on computer games is indicative of trends in voter turnout in national primaries.
What we're arguing is that behavioral analysis as well as the empirics demonstrate that a national primary would be less expensive. Now, can I ask you a question?
Yes, ask a question.
So in response to our second contention, you talk about how in our second point, you say that you're going to have less media coverage with a national primary.
Yes.
Why does that make sense when reporters can report on the entire nation as a whole rather than just one state at a time?
There isn't a single reporter that can report on the entire nation as a whole at one time.
Well, sure, but a news organization is going to be reporting on all the states instead of just on one state, right?
No, but think about that. That can happen all the time. There's crowding out effects that happen now, as you talked about. Sometimes when things happen in one part of the country, they're overshadowed by stories in other parts of the country. How can you possibly expect a news campaign to be able to report on 50 different primaries in one day simultaneously?
So here's the really simple analysis. In the current system, they're dedicating all of their attention to these states like Iowa and New Hampshire that A, aren't represented in the country, but B, aren't the whole nation. Whereas in the national primary, they're reporting on the most important areas, the metropolitan areas where the most people are.
After Iowa and New Hampshire, the media does not cut off. They then do the same type of extensive attention to each primary individual day.
But just at one state at a time where you don't get the big picture like you do
It's
with
a
the
lot like
national
sharing
primary.
a birthday with everyone else. It's much more special if you have your own day. You get more attention that way. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So something that you talked about is polarization.
Sure.
Is there a link between turnout and polarization? And if so, why?
This is the exact analysis that we give you in case. A, it's an empirical analysis, and the logic is really simple. Those who are more engaged in politics have stronger viewpoints, and they're more likely to be at one of the spectrums, more conservative or more liberal.
Does that mean that they vote in a more polarized way?
Yes, they're going to select the candidate that best represents their views, right?
No, but that's not direct, because sometimes the most indicative view is that if I'm a Republican, for example, if I'm an extreme Republican, I might vote for a more moderate candidate so that they have a better chance of winning the general election.
Okay.
Because I might like all of the Republican candidates better than the Democratic contemporary.
Right.
So I factor that into my decision.
Sure,
right?
but I wouldn't say that's actually true. One, I would say that most people vote based on who's representing their interest. But second, when you actually look at what's happened in practice, the candidates who win the nomination are the more polarized candidates.
You don't have to say that it's true. We give an empirical analysis.
We do too.
Can we see yours? Before my summary, could we see your analysis? Yes, what one it is for?
Okay.
good. Here you go.
Response? We have 3 seconds right now, I think, but we're gonna keep it.
We're good. Is everybody ready? There's going to be an observation and then 3 voting issues. Okay. The observation we've given you throughout the round is that the best government is the most representative government. My opponents say there is an a priori here because if we really want to represent the people, we have to look to their poll saying that people want this policy, right? But in analyzing this, we have to realize that the one-day primary is one policy, right? So maybe they get representation on one policy, but if we distort the system forever to make it unrepresentative, they're losing on an infinite number of future policies. We're outweighing on time frame there. Not only that, but the reason we don't just poll to decide everything is because not everyone is informed on these topics, linking into our logic about voter information. The first voting issue is going to be about creating competitive elections. Now, my opponent's main piece of evidence here is about how it costs 60% more in the current process. There are 2 problems here. Hunter addresses why this doesn't really mirror the decisions of candidates when we're looking at the decisions of college students betting on games, but secondarily, the key thing is our argument is not about the total cost of the process. It's about the upfront cost. US News tells you that it costs more upfront, which means that only the most wealthy and well-connected candidates are even going to be on the ballot, which means that even if it costs more, that we're showing you that they're able to gain money as they gain momentum, which is what Lau tells you. Even they're going to see a 14 to 20% decrease in effort in primaries when we have the one-day system, which is problematic. But they tell you 2 things, and they say that it's bad to choose our nominees under this system because it's unrepresentative. But there are 2 problems. The University of Missouri evidence tells you specifically that the people who vote in these early primaries aren't different when it comes to policy positions than the rest of the country, even if they look different. Not only that, let's look at the second voter, which is vote splitting. And my opponents say that Deltis looks at the current system. Yes, and he says it's the worst possible thing. Not only that, but my opponents say that any policy proposal would include a runoff. They say that they all have so far, but they didn't pass. Why are we going to look to that probability when literally we've tried it so many times and it hasn't proven to be probable? At that point, vote splitting is key. The third voter is going to be turnout. My opponents say that turnout is really good, but they don't respond to the Pingley analysis, which says there is no statistical relationship between the date of the primary and the amount of turnout. They also don't respond to the fact that the people who turn out in primaries aren't ideologically different. At that point, we're getting the vote splitting impact and the turnout turns, meaning that we're 34% more likely to select the most representative nominee for the long term.
So we're on prep time. That's good for prep time. We have about 37 seconds remaining.
All right, judges? Democracy isn't a spectator sport. Understand that the biggest impact in today's round is going to be off of turnout, because the only way to get a representative government is to ask everyone what they think and to give them an equal voice. At that point, you can't have a truly representative government, as they say is the most important thing, without having more people turn out. Now, we show you that turnout is going to increase because it makes people feel like their vote matters, especially in these later states. They give you this Pingley analysis that says that there's no relationship between when the primary is and turnout. However, in their own author's conclusion, she says that the reason that she found no actual relationship is because she didn't control all the independent variables, and she actually concedes the warrant that when it's later, it deters people from voting because they feel like their vote doesn't matter. At that point, we're going to be increasing turnout, which outweighs everything they say, because it's a prerequisite to representation, as I said, because you can't have representation if you don't hear people's voices. But more importantly, it impacts to distorting policy, and they don't really address this, and this is our second impact and our second contention. We tell you that when there's low turnout, the people with the most more people with economically conservative opinions vote than non-economically conservative opinions, which means that low-income people's interests aren't being heard, especially in welfare, housing, and healthcare. This outweighs because even if the candidate is more representative, the policy needs to be representative too, and that policy is not being implemented in the con world. Now, they just came up here and talked about vote splitting, but understand that this runoff is the most likely type of national primary that's going to be passed, because it's the only policy that's been proposed. They say that these didn't pass in the past, but it's not because of the runoff, it's because of other reasons, just politically infeasibility to all generally, but the runoff solves. Now, really important, remember that they dropped the terms that we give you on their other two main voters. First of all, when they talk about dark horse candidates increasing competitiveness, this is bad because we want establishment candidates. First of all, they're more experienced, so they'll actually pass representative policy, and second of all, they're more representative because they're establishment. That means they're more representative of their party members and of the people. So for all these reasons, we affirm.
You guys ready?
Yes, so for speakers, I believe that we have the first question.
Right.
Is everybody good?
Yeah.
Excellent. So you say that establishment candidates are better because they make better policy. This does concede competitiveness, however. You're just saying that you'll outweigh it on the better policy.
You're saying, okay, like, yeah. Okay, yeah, because
Excellent.
The reason that it's bad is because even if the dark horse candidates are more competitive, we don't want that, because the reason that they're not competitive in the first place is because they're the ones espousing the extremist, or not extremist, but the more extreme fringe views, and not the moderate ones that the establishment candidates are espousing.
You say I have to feel like my vote matters in order for me to vote. If the election is uncompetitive, will my vote really matter?
It's not like the election's not competitive. Like in 2008, there were two establishment candidates, Obama and Clinton. It was still really competitive.
Obama was not an establishment candidate.
Yeah, he spoke at the Democratic National Convention.
You just gave an example of an exceedingly competitive primary that went down to the last state.
Literally, Obama and Clinton. In 2008, it ended really late in the election cycle because it was so competitive.
That's our precise point, though. That occurred in the status quo in the current system. In the national primary, people like Obama, who don't have all the money of Clinton, but before the primary,
Obama would still be able to launch a national campaign because he still had a lot of money at his disposal at the beginning of the primary process.
Came from individual donations he garnered over on the campaign trail.
Yes.
That's not actually true. Even in the beginning, he would have been able to launch a national campaign. He might have gotten more money after Iowa, but he would have been able to do it in the first place.
Competitiveness decline.
But here's the thing.
You guys are kind of conceding to when you say the establishment's just always better.
Here's the bigger problem, is you guys again drop the warrants. You're trying to rely on your evidence,
we're
but you ignore the fact
as to
why a national primary is going to be more expensive. Because after that initial race, which is still an upfront cost because it's really early in the primary process, the winner has to spend more to capitalize on the race, and the loser has to spend more to catch up to the winner.
Let's put this in the real world then. Take Bernie Sanders, for example, a very poor candidate. It's more affordable for him to launch a campaign in Iowa than it is for him to instantly launch into a national campaign.
Did Bernie win?
No,
No, but he's
stayed
in the race,
competitive.
which is competitiveness.
He wasn't competitive at all, like,
but here's
throughout.
the
He won
difference.
Iowa.
That's
Clinton
not enough
did,
for you
from
to
the
say that.
beginning.
You can't just say like it's not competitive because Bernie Sanders didn't win. In your system, Bernie Sanders wouldn't have
Okay.
been able to run
Wait, why is that true? Like,
because he doesn't
We
have enough
give
money
you the
up front.
warrants. We
He
say
might just be
specifically
able-
the
okay.
impact isn't the amount of money
Okay,
spent,
right.
it's the amount of money required up front to get
Okay,
noticed.
sure. Like he still has a large amount of money. His net worth is about $3 million. He would have been able to do that. So the type of candidate
Hold on,
that wouldn't
hold
be
on.
able to do that is
First of all,
somebody
I'm
who
gonna
has
call that evidence
absolutely
'cause
no
I've heard a lot of
notoriety,
people
like they're
say
not a
he's actually
senator.
a lot in debt, but like, you know, like,
What?
I mean, that's like
But
your
also,
analysis.
this is,
Okay.
this is all one example, but the point is
Right.
that
Okay.
the broader system is true. There is an increase in competition, even if underdogs don't win. There is value to having them being able to be in the race in the first place.
What is that value?
Bernie Sanders holds people like Hillary Clinton accountable.
Wait, why?
Because voters now have someone else that they can turn to when they're dissatisfied with the establishment candidate.
Not only that, though,
Okay.
but we bring up the idea that not voting
Oh my
is
God.
evidence
Sorry, I
of
can
being
just talk.
satisfied with government.
Wait, they're not satisfied with government, with the
Right,
establishment?
the right to vote is also the
But
right
who's
not to
more
vote. The fact that
representative?
someone doesn't
A
vote
fringe
indicates
candidate
that they
or the
don't want to
establishment
change
candidate?
government.
Okay, that's fine.
Do we have any more prep time?
I believe we have like 30 seconds.
I believe we have 30 seconds.
I don't know if that's the official.
That's what I wrote down in my paper, but I.
I have 21.
Okay, so we're good.
Okay, we're out of time. Alright, so for those of you that would like a roadmap, I'm going to discuss the framework, or the dispute between frameworks, and then their argument about turnout, our argument about competition. Is everyone ready? Let's start out with Sebastian and I's observation about representative government being the end goal of American democracy. And my opponents say, well, you need votes to know whether or not it's representative. That's not true. They drop the response that I make in rebuttal that Sebastian talks about again in summary, which is that the right to vote in America is also the right not to vote. In fact, in many cases, people's choice not to vote is indicative that they don't want to see a change in the system. Being not active politically does not mean that you're disenfranchised. It just means that you're content. That being said, Eileen says in her summary that the main reason to vote for them is based on turnout. That's the one argument that they go for. We beat that argument for 3 reasons. First, if you look at the University of Missouri evidence, they write that even if turnout is low, even if the election is based on Iowa and New Hampshire, that isn't bad for the well-being of government. Specifically, they note that Iowa and New Hampshire are some of the more representative states. They vote in line with the rest of the country. Secondly, we give you the Pingley analysis, which says that there's no relationship between the date of a primary and the amount of turnout to be expected. Now, she responds by saying that there's some methodological issues, but we are the only one that contextualize it by giving the California example. When Californians voted in 2 decided primaries, they saw record high turnouts, one of the highest in the country. They never give you a counterexample. Thirdly and finally, though, we give you the Gaze evidence, which is cleanly extended, which is that if an election is more competitive, there is more turnout. That means that they lose turnout, but if we win competition, we turn it anyways. That being said, our one voting issue is based on competition. We would say that it's good to have more candidates running the race. They say that there's a winnowing process and it's based on momentum. That winnowing process is not unique. They drop the U.S. News evidence that says that in a national primary, the only people that will be able to enter the race in the first place are those that have enough money in their back pocket to launch a nationwide campaign. That's not good for the system. But in fact, we give you the analysis, which says that when you have a competitive election, you have more turnout, and you increase the chance that you elect the most democratically representative candidate because you make them show that they're viable through repeated competition in different states. That's why we give you the Deltas analysis, which they drop in their summary, which says that by having sequential elections instead of one national primary, you increase the chance that you elect the most democratically representative nominee by 34%. That is the reason that you can negate, and I hope that all 5 of you will do so.
We're in our remaining 37 seconds of prep time. Is everybody ready? Our primary interest is a national primary. In evaluating today's round, you need to look at two things. First, how representative the system is and making sure that everybody's voice is heard, and then second, making sure that that representation actually translates into policy that represents the people's interest. When you do that, the pro clearly wins. The first reason why is in our second contention. Remember, we showed you, according to Cook, that with a national primary, you make everybody's voice equally meaningful, which increases participation. Alschler concludes that there is no doubt that with a national primary, because of this phenomena, you will substantially increase voter turnout. Now, our opponents try to say that Iowa and New Hampshire are representative states, but that doesn't matter when the late states aren't voting, because even if those people wanted to vote differently, they don't have the capability to do so. And then they try to talk about how there's this Pingley analysis saying that there is actually no difference empirically. Remember, the methodology of that isn't good, as she finds that she doesn't control for variables, and she actually concludes that a national late states are deterred from voting. Now, this means that we win the round for a few reasons. First, the right to vote is a fundamental right in a democracy, and it's the prerequisite to getting into all other democratic rights. The second is that it directly impacts into policy. Our opponents only respond to polarization, but they never respond to the Laley analysis that finds that more wealthy people vote, which influences primaries that way. That's why McKelvey finds that because of primary voters being more wealthy than the average citizens, there's less policy spent on housing, welfare, and healthcare. They never responded to that analysis. That's a direct translation into policy of representation that you get with a national primary that you don't have in the current system. Now, the final reason why it outweighs is because our opponents' arguments just don't make sense. When you go over and look at their argument about supporting underdogs in the establishment, remember that the establishment candidates are going to be better. They're the ones who actually have experience. So when you have these fringe voters actually getting into office, they aren't able to pass the policy that represents the people because they don't have that experience in government. Then they never respond to the main contradiction in their case. They're saying that they're making elections more competitive, but they're also stopping this vote splitting. Remember, vote splitting is the definition of a competitive election, as candidates have to compete for the same votes. They never respond to that. Then they try to look at deltas, but again, they never respond to the fact that that functioned almost as a national primary, as 22 states had primaries on the same day in that election cycle. So for all these reasons, we urge a pro vote.